Welcome back. My name is Sinta. If you don't know me, Hajime means hello in Japanese. I lived in Japan for 9 years, and I used to speak fluent Japanese was my whole thing. Okay, so this month is Black History Month, and even though my skin tone is a little bit lighter, bear in mind over time, and if you come from a mixed family like I do, your skin tone will not always be as dark as some. Pigmentation is different, and also there's not as much sun here in the States as there would be in South Africa during this time. So what happens is, obviously, since I'm not sitting in the sun during the wintertime, I look a little bit lighter. Going back to the whole thing of Black History Month, my mom is African, South African. Africa is a continent. Let's just explain that. South Africa is one of the countries in the African continent, on the southern hemisphere of South Africa. So, and I'm going to clip some pictures of my family in this section of it. I think it needs to be spoken about because people always try to, I think it's important to remember your history as well, besides other people's history. And in our family, we had the first Black African educator in 1840 something. I don't remember the exact dates. I'll probably get the information later. And he came from a Khoi descent background, so I know in our family we have Khoisan, 100% Khoisan. I know probably in a distant land somewhere it's in some genetics. I do know that my height is not the normal size of any American you would find. I'm very, very short, so in regards to my genetics, I got it on the short end and not necessarily the color of my skin. So that's how it is for me. Everybody's different genetically. For my master's in fine arts. So fine arts is not just educating with how to paint and draw. Fine arts also implements and implicates that you learn history of all parts of the world. And because I was living in South Africa for my master's, I learned a lot more about the African history through the arts, because you might not have had written books back in the day. So they had sculptures and crafts and huts, and musical instruments were also part of the arts. And crafting was basically our history, was the history of Africa. So learning African art history, focusing on specifically South African art, because I had learned South African art history in Johannesburg. It was an interesting experience to learn the contrast of global, because the topic was global versus local. And my subject was actually, my topic that I chose was identity. So I dove into a very, very complex discussion on who the Khoisan were and the history of what had happened to the people of the Khoi descent background, and the misdemeanors of the things that happened in history that people might not necessarily know in the United States. Now it's coming to the forefront. If you know anything about Saartjie Baartman, that was the topic I chose and discussed. And Bernice Cyril was an artist that I chose to discuss. We're talking about identity, so bringing the identities together, whether you're Black or white or mixed, and how that kind of separated the country. You had the apartheids. Okay, so if you don't know anything about the apartheids in South Africa, South Africa was a country of many, many cultures. Families started mixing with each other, and it became like this huge community of people of mixed descent from all parts of the world. We're talking India, we're talking Asia, we're talking Khoisan, we're talking, I don't know, maybe different parts of Africa, Northern Africa. And it just became this whole melting pot of a culture. So a lot of the things that we have in our family is Indian food. We also enjoy our curries and chilies from Thai dishes and stuff from different parts of Asia. There's a misconception when people see me that I'm not African. That is 100% incorrect. Africa is big. Africa is a continent. You cannot claim it as one country. It is not. This was a children's book I wrote about mixedness and how to appreciate everybody from all cultures. I actually do have it up for sale. But this is Africa. It's a continent, and the lower part of Africa would be South Africa. There are other countries within Africa, but I didn't focus on that. We're focusing on South Africa. The Khoi and the San people, who I think people are becoming a little bit more familiarized with what they are. They're the hunter-gatherer culture. So in different parts of the world, you get the people who started off or were predominantly there before all the other people started taking over and coming over down to the certain areas. The Khoisan were known to be predominantly the first to exist within that space. Historically, there might be more information that we do not know, but as of now, that is what that is about. The Khoisan were generally the first to have been existent within that proximity of that area during that time. Even before people started, like Christopher Columbus took over the United States, you had Jan van Riebeeck coming over from Holland, who was Dutch, obviously, and had brought over, same type of story, almost the same scenario, just in a different country. Yeah, Jan van Riebeeck was not a very nice guy, from what I've read. And that's part of the history that I've lost, because obviously I moved to the States and we had to learn a whole different history. But now we're getting back into South African history, and I'm giving you guys a bit of feel of what I studied. I studied music, but I also studied the political, the academic side of history. So we have Bernice Cyril, who's an absolutely phenomenal artist. She has made and paved many paved ways in many forms. I wrote about her for my thesis. And Moshekwa Langa was another artist besides Bernice Cyril, who I actually researched, who is from a different part of Africa, but I think resides in South Africa right now. Bernice Cyril is, and she actually is connected to our family. Not family-wise, but there have been friends who know her as a personal friend within our family, who happens to be mixed. And mixed comes in very many ways, many things. You know, the word that they use in South Africa is not the word they would use here in the United States, because it's a word that's very riddled with disruption in history. So we're not, the word starts with a C. We're not going to use it. And I use the word mixed because that is what it is. It's exactly what it is. It's mixed. And my mother's mixed, and I am trying not to forget, and this is why this video for me is important, or this video clip is important, is because this YouTube clip is because I think it's important to not just represent. We have history of musicians in our family. We have a famous drummer who was probably of darker complexity than myself, my mom, my grandmother. It goes way back. There were educators. My great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was the first black Khoisan educator within Khanatendal, which was predominantly Dutch, and he became one of the first teacher educators, because I suppose Khoisan would be considered black in modern context. It's a very interesting and kind of complex discussion. And then you have Pippa Scottness in South Africa, who is white South African artist, who brought the topic of Khoisan into the forefront, and many things, which unfortunate things have happened to the Khoi, which is why there are probably no more than about 300 or 200 of the original Khoi living within, I don't even know if they're in the Sahara Desert anymore. living in the proximities where you would have found them before, because globalization and economic transition and economic development started happening, and a lot of the people were losing their land because people just started taking over the land, and that was just basically it. So going back to the apartheids in South Africa, segregated people and separated people. So if you had a lighter skin, you would have to be on one side of the line, meaning one part of the family might be separated versus another side of the family, which was darker complexity. And this is why South Africa is so complicated to explain, is because people don't understand that there's misconception of genetics. I don't even think it's just because you look darker doesn't mean to say you have to be in one area. Just because it's like you're still family. It's like genetically, if you want to really go into it, you should get DNA tests and have everybody tested within the family to prove that we are indeed family. And that is one thing that people didn't do. They identified and separated people just off the color of their skin, which I think is unfortunately what is going on again in history, probably in the United States, without even justifying people's genetic background. I have genetics of Khoisan, and Khoisan are considered black. And it's, back then they didn't know what they were. They didn't, because they probably never had seen anybody else besides themselves for whenever. And so when Jan van Riebeck decided to come in and take over, it might have been the first time they had ever seen somebody of white complexity. So it's a very tricky subject. But I do want to, I wanted to bring up that my history I also have black history. And if I do not talk about it and even do a video on it, it might never be discovered. And it's pushed down. People think it's not important to talk about your personal family. You might have somebody of non-black complexity in your family, but in fact, they are part of your family. So, judgmental skepticism is what brings the segregation on a very big platform. It's a problem. It becomes an issue, because what happens now is you're separating yourself because you look a certain way and separating your history, which is a whole different story, just because people justify you for what they see you as. Just like the apartheid, they justify the apartheid. If you look lighter in one family, one section of the family, you would have to be in one side of Johannesburg versus another side. So it's very complicated, and I think it's very hurtful. I think my mom has gone through this. I have seen it. I've experienced discrimination I've seen it for myself, because my mom looked a certain way. People would always assume that I was not her daughter. And that was hurtful. So many things happened in my life that gave me the understanding that people just didn't understand much. I think it's important for people like us, like myself, who has been educated on many different platforms and countries, and lived in different countries, to open up that barrier of discussion and to make it aware that history is vast and very complex. And if one country has a lifestyle or one type of thing, does not mean to say that then another country has not gone through something similar. South Africa has actually gone through something close to what had happened in the United States during the time of, let's just say, when Christopher Columbus decided that he found the United States. So that during that time, something similar, Jan van Riebeck was also discovering and going to places that they had, because they assumed that the world was flat. So wherever the ship would go, they would go in different directions. Who knows if they really met? Maybe they did meet. Maybe Jan van Riebeck did meet Christopher Columbus. That would be another story in itself. And there might have been like a whole discussion or communication between ports and people and who was in charge of what and all. So the hierarchies are still there. And it's important to understand the misinterpretations of what South Africa was about. South Africa was dominated and controlled by the Dutch. Then the British came in and took over whatever the Dutch did not finish. So then you have the mixture of the two, but mainly Afrikaans is the language spoken, which is a language that was used or still used in South Africa as the predominant language. English is too, but I think Afrikaans is predominantly the main language that they speak there, which is rooted in the Dutch language. There's probably some French in there too. French, Dutch, and German. Not as much English in the Afrikaans, but there are those three major languages. So instead of me just doing a music day, I think it's important, or I thought it was important, that just bringing up a little bit of my background would be the time to talk about this. And yeah, it's just a very tough discussion to have, because you have to be willing to listen to my history if you're interested to know about not just Africa, but Southern Africa, South Africa. There's a very complex world beyond people talking about within that location. So I might not do going back to the music, my great uncle, I don't know if it was on my grandmother's side or my grandfather's side, was a recognized jazz drummer, from what I know. I don't remember his name to save my life. And then my grandmother was self-taught, and she played for the church, like the organ. She was like the organist, and she never learned how to read music. And her thing was playing by ear, and she was very good at it. So she memorized songs that people told her to memorize, and she would be on the organ playing away in the church. And oddly enough, my aunt is now a priest in a church within South Africa. So women can also be priests. Like, that is fantastic. Changes are occurring, which is fabulous. I think she just got her PhD in that. Wonderful, great news. So I have to, represent my family. I have a great family of mixed descent. I know more about my mixed family in South Africa than I do about my family here in the United States. It's just like that. It could be that my parents were discriminated for being a mixed family, and my Jewish dad's side was not necessarily always approve of it, which is, it's how it is, right? So I was stuck in the middle, and I just never learned. I learned a little bit about the family here, but I never really learned the whole complete background, a little bit. And part of my research was to actually go into my dad's history and my mom's history. So I wrote down both sections, which is kind of cool. Spectre family tree. That's Polish, I think. Spectre is Polish. So we have the Brooke Spectre family tree, which is my dad and my mother's side, which goes back to, my mom's side here. This is my mom's side. It's a very interesting family tree. So we have a whole history here of Zeevogel. So that it began over here, and I know that the history before that must have been lost because of our heritage and the Khoisan background and all that stuff. So it's somewhere, but we know that it started with a Khoisan, with a black, I guess Khoisan is black in the modern context, in our family, and things started happening. So we have a very educated family because of our past. My grandfather was a principal. My grandmother was also a principal. My grandmother was also a principal and started a kindergarten. My aunt started a kindergarten. It's we have an educated family in that context. So I don't want to lose the history. So I thought today would be a good day to really just talk about that. There's no like musically, as I said, drums was always part of, obviously part of my family. So that was interesting that I picked up on my heritage through being a young drummer at the time, playing piano, which is also my grandmother's side. And my mom's also a music teacher, and she was an opera singer, and she actually was one of the first. She was considered to, during that time, she didn't get all the credit because of the skin color she had, so that's also a history that was lost and very unfortunate. But now things are beginning to happen, and I feel as if it's my time to talk out about my mom's rights and my rights and my family's rights. And African Heritage Month is just that. So I'm talking about today that kind of stuff. Songs that people recognize. If you want to go more in depth with music, jazz, blues, and yeah, there's more history, and then instrumental things like drums and and percussion instruments dominantly came from different parts of Africa. Sure, maybe some things like there were instruments like in Brazil that were also percussion. So percussion was like, it's the first thing that people learned how to do. That was like the first type of instrument, because you didn't have the technology or the equipment to create something like a keyboard. So that came much later on, but the root of Africa is definitely percussion. There's no question about it. The congos, the djembes, the shakers that are made out of cocoon shells. And yeah, they're usually put in Swaziland. They usually put them on their legs, and then when they do their dances, they make noises, which is interesting. So cultural dance is also a big part of African culture. I don't have any personal designs that I make my own stuff. So I think that was what I wanted to talk about, is that I just feel as if everybody kind of pushes me away out of the African history, but in fact, my history is very African, and some of it Black, some of it's Asian, some of it's Caucasian. It's mixed. I mean, there's no way around it. It's just something that I've had to acknowledge. It's just what it is. My husband's Cambodian, so I get it. I understand the culturalness, and that's what I wanted to talk about, is that my family is from South Africa, and yeah, it's important to represent when it's time to, right? So this is the time where I can represent and talk a little bit more about my cultural background and my history, because whether people like it or not, I am African. So be it. I might not be African American, although my mom put me down as African American for the school, which was a little uncomfortable because I couldn't really explain to people, like, my mom put me down as African American, even though I'm not really like color, but in theory I am, because I'm from Africa and I am American, so put the two together, and I suppose I am African American to that extent. So I've never been able to use that word for myself, even though it does hypothetically speak about what I really am. I am African and I am American, but I'm not Black African American. I'm mixed African American. Let's put it that way. I don't even know if I can use that word, but that's what it is. So thank you for listening. It's definitely a day on education when it comes down to lecturing about your background. Don't ever forget, if you have family who are of Black background descent, go look at the history, go check it out, find some research on your family. It's very interesting to find what you find if you're into that. I know my family is very into doing the research on our family because we have a very interesting past. Our background is so covered in so many different things, and we're educators in our family, so educators always want to relearn and re-educate stuff, right? And reassess things. And that's where I am right now. So thank you again. Arigatou gozaimashita, matashita sayonara. And jana bye-bye, which is thank you in Japanese. Matashita, which is also like see you later. And then sayonara, which is goodbye. And then jana bye-bye, which is basically goodbye. So I don't speak Afrikaans. It's not a language my mom said I should learn. I learned Japanese instead of Afrikaans because we lived in Japan, and probably a wiser option. I preferred it better. It sounds prettier. I learned more of the culture, which was great. And there you have it. So thank you for the little chat. I thought that this is the day to represent my heritage, my African heritage. You know, I am African. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I am African, and that is how it is. And that's where I am right now. And thank you again. And I'll see you in the next one.